I was easing the van backward out of the driveway a little after 8, already feeling that tight pressure in my chest like I couldn't quite get a full breath. When she stepped onto her porch holding a coffee mug and narrowed her eyes at the storage box on the roof. The extra gas can, the folding chairs strapped down in the back, all of it. She said, "You look like you're escaping the country." I chuckled and shut off the engine for a moment. That's kind of the plan. For months, I'd been fixing up that van in the evenings and on weekends. Replacing hoses, patching wires, working on the brakes, swapping the fan belt, and even installing that tiny sink in the back that barely functioned. The small bed frame I built was wrong the first time, and I had to redo it completely. It was old, ugly, and stubborn, but it belonged to me, and that trip was supposed to belong to me too. No deadlines, no boss, no checking in with anyone. Just me, the road, and enough time to stop feeling like I was stuck reliving the same week again and again. Rachel leaned against the porch railing and stared at the van, which had personally annoyed her. "And you actually think this thing will make it halfway across the country? It just needs to make it out of town first," I replied. She smiled into her coffee. Rachel always seemed put together in a way that made me more self-conscious. Even standing there in a faded gray t-shirt and loose shorts, hair messily tied back, she somehow looked sharper than anyone heading into work. She was more than 10 years older than me, divorced, usually quiet, and not someone I ever expected to be joking with from my driveway. I shrugged and said, mostly teasing, "You could come with me and see." She didn't hesitate. She just said, "Okay." I stared at her. Okay, like okay. Okay, as in give me 15 minutes. I actually laughed because I assumed she was still joking, but she set her mug down on the porch rail and walked inside. Just turned and vanished like this had all been planned. I sat there with the engine idling, one hand gripping the wheel, wondering if I should just leave before she came back out and laughed it off. She didn't. 12 minutes later, she came down the steps carrying a duffel bag, a hoodie tied around her waist, sunglasses resting on her head. And that same calm expression like she was heading out to run errands. Not climbing into a van with the guy next door for a trip neither of us had discussed for more than half a minute. I leaned over and pushed the passenger door open. "Rachel, are you serious?" She tossed her bag inside. "I'm completely serious. What about your job? I have vacation days. Your house, it'll still be there." I looked at her for another second. "You really want to do this?" That's when her expression shifted slightly, less playful, more real. She said, "Luke, if I go back inside, I'm going to spend the whole day cleaning a kitchen that's already clean. So yes, I really want to do this." That was all I needed. She stepped inside, closed the door, and the entire feel of the van shifted instantly. It had carried the scent of motor oil, canvas, and stale coffee before. Now there was a trace of her shampoo mixed in, her bag resting by her feet, her knees nearly brushing the glove compartment. And just like that, the trip I had imagined alone for months no longer felt solitary at all. We left town laughing more than we probably should have. At the first gas stop, she returned with terrible roadside coffee, sunflower seeds, and 2 greasy breakfast sandwiches she insisted were essential for morale. She teased me about my paper map, even though she was the one who had already lost signal. 10 minutes later, I caught her opening the cabinets in the back while I was driving, inspecting my packing system like she'd been assigned as official van life critic. By midday, it felt strangely normal, like she had always been there. Then I noticed the temperature gauge creeping upward. At first, I told myself it wasn't serious. Old van, warm weather, long uphill stretch. But within another minute, the needle climbed higher, then higher still. Rachel straightened in her seat and said, "Luke, I see it. You definitely see it." "Thanks, very helpful." Steam began curling out from under the front edge of the hood just as I steered onto the shoulder. Gravel snapped beneath the tires. The engine gave one rough shudder when I shut it off, and then everything fell silent except for the roar of trucks rushing past, shaking the van as they went. For a moment, neither of us moved. Rachel slowly turned to face me. "Well, great start." I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let out a short laugh, mostly because the alternative was swearing until I lost my voice. When I stepped out and lifted the hood, a blast of heat hit me straight in the face. Coolant had splattered across nearly half the engine compartment. I stood there staring at it, hands on my hips, trying not to feel like an idiot. Months of effort, and we barely made it half a day. Rachel came around to stand beside me, peering into the engine as if either of us could fix it just by looking. She said, "Give me the optimistic version first. The optimistic version is it just got a little overexcited. And the real version," I exhaled, "hose clamp, maybe." "Maybe something worse," she nodded once. "All right, then we deal with that version." That was the moment it stopped feeling like a casual joke and started feeling real. Heat, bad luck, no quick solution, and she's still standing beside me anyway. Cars kept rushing past. The sun kept beating down. Rachel grabbed the water jug from the van without being asked and handed it to me. Then she opened a pack of crackers and said we were not dealing with a roadside breakdown on empty stomachs. I should have felt annoyed or embarrassed or wished I'd left alone as I planned. Instead, I found myself looking at her in that heat, hair blowing across her face, smiling like this chaos was somehow part of the adventure, and thinking the trip had already turned into something I hadn't expected. We were still parked on that shoulder an hour later, both of us dusty, sweating, surviving on crackers and determination. When I finally tightened the clamp enough to try again, Rachel held the flashlight for me, even though it was still broad daylight, mostly so she could lean in and say things like, "That looks expensive, and you look like someone pretending this is under control." "It is under control," I said. She glanced at the damp front of my shirt, then at the small puddle forming beneath the van. "Sure," but when I turned the engine back on, it settled into a steady idle. Not perfect, not smooth, but stable enough to risk continuing. I stood there listening, waiting for something to go wrong again. Rachel stepped closer and handed me the last of the water. "So, what's the verdict?" I looked down the empty road ahead, then back at the van. "The verdict is we drive like people who suddenly understand limits," she grinned. "That's not how you were driving this morning." By the time evening came, we were nowhere near where I had planned to stop. The delay on the roadside had cost us half the day. So I pulled into a cheap campground tucked near a stretch of tall pines and a narrow lake that looked far nicer in the fading light than it probably was. We set up the chairs, cooked noodles on the small burner, and for about 20 minutes it felt like the trip had finally found its rhythm again. Then the sky shifted. Rachel noticed it first. "That doesn't look good." I turned and saw clouds rolling in low and fast, dark enough to turn the water almost gray. The wind picked up sharply, lifting the paper bowls from the table and sending one of my napkins flying into the trees. "Perfect," I muttered. The first drops were large, warm at first, then colder and heavier, and suddenly it wasn't just rain, it was a full wall of it. We both lunged toward the open bins and bedding at the same time. Rachel grabbed the food crate. I tried folding the table halfway and nearly crushed my own hand in the process. She was laughing while trying to save the coffee tin, which made me laugh too, even though everything was going wrong again. "Why are you laughing?" I shouted. "Because this is terrible." The van felt way too small to stay organized once we started tossing everything inside. Wet towels, shoes, bags, half-packed food, chairs dripping onto the floor. Both of us are trying to peel off soaked layers without smacking each other in the face. Rain pounded the roof so loudly we had to raise our voices just to hear each other. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed platform with my spare blanket wrapped around her shoulders, water still trailing down one side of her face. "For the record," she said, "your glamorous road life is exactly as advertised." I handed her a pair of dry socks. "You can still go home." She looked up at me from under the blanket. "I'm not going home because of the weather and bad noodles." That hit harder than I expected. We barely slept. The air inside the van turned damp and sticky. My back ached. Rachel claimed more than half the blanket and denied it without blinking. Sometime near dawn, the storm finally passed, leaving everything outside soaked and dripping. We made coffee by the side door in that strange quiet that follows a rough night. Both of us were too tired to pretend we looked presentable. Rachel took one sip and grimaced. "This is awful." Then she took another sip. "No." That set the tone for the next 2 days. Nothing went completely right, but somehow everything kept improving. We missed a turn because I was focused on driving, and she was telling me about the first apartment she had after her divorce. A tiny place above a laundromat where she could hear every machine rattling through the floor. By the time we realized we'd gone miles off course, the paved road had turned narrow and rough. then into one of those back roads that feels like it exists only because nobody bothered to remove it. I should have been irritated, but where it led us was incredible. Not famous, not marked, just a wide open overlook above a riverbend with no one else in sight. We stood there eating gas station chips and staring at it like we had earned something. Rachel nudged my shoulder with hers. See. Your terrible planning works. That wasn't planning. Still counts. That night we parked at a scruffy little spot off the road and ate the last decent food we had. It was quiet enough to hear every faint sound outside. Too quiet, maybe. I was packing up the cooler when Rachel froze and pointed past me. There, she whispered. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed movement near the edge of the light. Something low and quick sniffing around the bag where we had left the bread. Not big, but bold enough to make us both freeze. Rachel grabbed my arm without thinking, fingers tightening around it. "Don't move," she said, which was ironic because she was gripping me hard enough to leave marks. I stepped forward carefully, made noise, and banged the lid against the side of the van. The animal darted into the brush, taking half a loaf with it. Rachel let out a long breath and then started laughing again. That tired kind of laugh where you're half a second from losing it either way. "We are terrible at this," she said. "We're learning." She was still holding my arm. Neither of us mentioned it right away. When she finally let go, it was slower than necessary. We stood there close in the dim light. Both exhausted, both dirty, both smiling as the trip had quietly turned into something private without asking permission. By then, it didn't feel like I had a passenger anymore. It felt like every bad turn, every soaked night, every dumb roadside fix had slowly put us on the same side of things. The first time I really realized how far gone I was happened in a motel parking lot that smelled like wet pavement and old fryer grease. The weather had turned again that afternoon, and after another hour of pretending we could outrun it, Rachel looked at me and said, "I'm done proving I can suffer for the experience. That's fair. I want walls. I want a shower. I want a bed that doesn't fold out of your storage setup." I found the first cheap place with a vacancy sign flickering in the rain. The room was small. The carpet had seen better days, and the air conditioner sounded like it might quit at any second. But when Rachel stepped into the shower and came out 20 minutes later in an oversized t-shirt with damp hair and no road dust left on her, the entire room felt different, almost too small. We ended up eating vending machine snacks on the bed because the diner next door had already closed. Rachel sat cross-legged near the headboard, picking salt from a bag of chips, while I sat on the edge of the mattress pretending to be interested in the muted local news. She watched me for a moment and said, "You've been acting weird for like an hour." "I have not. You absolutely have," I looked at her. "Maybe I'm just tired." She gave me that flat look she used when she knew I was avoiding something. Luke, that was the problem with being on the road that long. After enough hours together, there was nowhere left to hide. She knew when I was frustrated, when I was worried, when I was pretending something didn't matter. And I knew she knew. So I said the dumb version because it was the only one I could manage. "This stopped feeling casual a while ago." Rachel didn't answer immediately. She set the chip bag beside her and looked at me in a way that made my pulse pick up for no clear reason. Then she said quietly, "I know. That should make it easier, right?" I let out a short laugh and rubbed the back of my neck. "Okay, that somehow makes me more nervous." That got a real smile from her. She shifted closer, not all at once, just enough that our knees touched. "You think I got into your van because I wanted better scenery? I thought maybe you were having some kind of breakdown." "I was," she said. "You just happened to be there at the right moment." There was a pause after that. "Not awkward, just full." Then she added, "And somewhere between the overheating engine, the storm, getting lost, and almost losing our food to wildlife." I stopped remembering what my normal life even felt like. I turned more toward her. "Is that a good thing? It is when normal felt like being half asleep." That landed deeper than anything dramatic could have. Rachel didn't talk like she was trying to impress anyone. When she said something real, it stayed with you. She told me more openly than before how hard the last few years had been without looking dramatic from the outside. Work, home, errands. The same quiet evenings, the same polite conversations, the same sense that she had turned into someone who just maintained things. A house, a routine, a version of herself people expected. Nothing terrible, which somehow made it worse. I got too good at getting through days, she said. That's all. I didn't have a wise response. I just said, you don't seem half asleep with me. Rachel looked at me for a long moment, then leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't rushed. That's what I remember most. After all the movement, all the miles, all the small disasters, it happened in a way that felt calm, like we were both finally stopping, pretending we hadn't been heading there. After that, the room felt even quieter. The rain outside, the weak hum of the air conditioner, her hand resting on my shoulder, my mouth suddenly dry. Nothing about it felt like a fling or some reckless road story. It felt like something we had already built without naming. The next morning, we were short on money in a way that stopped being funny. I sat at the small table by the window with receipts, fuel costs, the motel bill, and the cash I had left, rechecking numbers because I didn't like the first answer. Rachel came out of the bathroom, drying her hair, and took one look at me. That bad? We need to be smarter, I said. A lot smarter. She crossed the room and sat beside me. No panic, no blame. Show me. So I did. We cut anything extra. Cheap food, fewer paid stops, no unnecessary detours. I hated admitting I had miscalculated. Months of fixing the van, planning the route, thinking I had enough. Rachel listened, then placed some cash from her bag onto the table. I looked at it. No, yes, I invited you. And I came, she said. This is both of us now. I started to argue again, but she placed her hand over mine and held it there. Luke, stop trying to carry all of it alone. That should have embarrassed me. Instead, it did something worse. It made me start picturing a future I had no right to think about yet. Not just the trip, something after. Later that day, we still snapped at each other when the van developed a new rattling sound and I pulled too hard onto gravel. I told her not to worry. She said telling her not to worry wasn't the same as having a plan. I insisted I had a plan. She said my plan looked like staring at the engine until it respected me. 5 minutes later, we were both laughing again because she wasn't wrong. That's when I understood this wasn't just chemistry built on scenery and distance from home. Trouble kept showing up, and every time it did, we faced it together. No drama, no scorekeeping, just both of us handling the same problem. That night, parked under a washed-out sky with the doors open to cool air, Rachel rested her head against my shoulder and said, I'm starting to hate the idea of this ending. I didn't answer right away because the truth felt too big. Then I said, yeah, me too. And for the rest of that evening, with the road still stretching ahead and home far enough away to ignore, the van didn't feel like a vehicle anymore. It felt like a life we had somehow slipped into by accident, and neither of us wanted to be the one to call it temporary. The last stretch home was the hardest part of the entire trip, which felt unfair after everything else. By then, the road had trained us into a rhythm I didn't even have to think about. Rachel handed me coffee before I asked. I checked the van at every fuel stop automatically. We packed faster, cleaned faster, argued less, and somehow knew when the other needed quiet. It should have made the drive back easier. Instead, it made every mile feel heavier because we both knew what waited at the end. Not some dramatic disaster, just normal life. Her porch, my driveway, the same street where this had all started as a joke. The van started acting up again about 2 hours from home, nothing major at first. A rough pull, then a shudder, then a sound underneath that made my stomach drop. I eased us onto the shoulder and shut it down before it got worse. Rachel stared out the windshield for a moment, then leaned back in her seat. Of course, I let out a short laugh. Yeah, of course. We stepped out into the hot wind and the constant rush of passing trucks, and I slid halfway under the van using the thin mat I kept in the back, dust getting in my face. Metal ticking as it cooled, my shirt clinging to my back. Rachel crouched nearby, handing me tools, holding the flashlight, asking quick questions when I needed them, and staying quiet when I didn't. It turned out to be a loose bracket and a belt that had shifted just enough to cause trouble without completely failing. Not the worst situation, but still enough to drain time and patience. By the time I pulled myself back out, my hands were coated in grease. Rachel stood and passed me the water bottle. You look terrible. Thank you. You're welcome. I drank half of it in one go. Then I looked at the van, the road ahead, and finally at her. We can still make it, she nodded, but her eyes weren't on the van. She was watching me with that same steady look she had in the motel room when neither of us was pretending anymore. We got back on the road just as the sun was setting. Neither of us said much after that, not because something was wrong, but because things weren't simple anymore. Home was getting closer with every mile, and the question we had managed to keep ahead of us was now sitting right there between us. Was this only real because we were moving? When we turned onto our street, it hit harder than I expected. Her house is on the right, mine is just past it. Same yards, same mailboxes, the same quiet neighborhood that had felt too small the morning I left. I parked in front of my place and shut off the engine. The silence after that long drive felt off somehow. Rachel didn't open her door, neither did I. I looked down at my hands on the wheel and said, "So, I guess this is where everything goes back to normal." The second the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Rachel stayed quiet long enough that I finally turned to her. She had one hand resting on her bag, but she hadn't picked it up. Then she said, "I don't want normal." I didn't respond right away because I wasn't even sure I'd heard her correctly. She exhaled slowly and looked out through the windshield at both houses. "I mean it. I don't want to walk back inside, unpack, and act like this was just some wild thing I did for a couple of weeks before going back to my scheduled life." My pulse felt too loud in my chest. "Rachel, no, let me say it properly," she said. Now there was a slight tremor in her voice, just enough to make it real. "I left because I was tired of feeling like I was barely living my own life. And somewhere along this trip, with all the mess, the storms, the breakdowns, the cheap food, and you yelling at this van like it was a person, I started to feel like myself again." Then she looked directly at me. "Not the version that just keeps things running. Me, I couldn't come up with anything clever. All I had was the truth." "Then stay." It came out rougher than I intended. Rachel held my gaze for another second, then gave a small, almost disbelieving laugh, like she'd spent the whole drive waiting for one solid reason not to fall back into her old routine. She reached down, grabbed her duffel bag, and instead of opening her door, she pushed it behind my seat. Just like that. No speech, no hesitation, just a decision. I stared at the bag, then at her. "That's it," she smiled. "That's it. Would you have the courage to leave your old life behind? Let's talk in the comments." "You're really not going home?" She glanced at her house, then back at me. "I am home,"